Hey everyone, we're at the end of 2019, so it's time for another recap of all of the biological science news that happened and that I talked about in 2019. This was a pretty exciting year for science, so let's get started. In the medical community, we saw some stem cell research that could lead to new ways to regrow bone. There was a study that found a salamander-like way for humans to regrow cartilage. A study examined how loud noises alter the chemistry of your ear and lead to temporary deafness. There was some research into how specific microbes in your gut help or hinder the metabolism of certain medicines, and that can influence how your body responds to those medicines. And there was a massive study that proved that the measles, mumps, rubella vaccine, or the MMR vaccine, explicitly does not cause autism. Also in development, there's a potential vaccine for chlamydia that's currently undergoing clinical trials for safety and efficacy. And on the topic of vaccines, there's a new Ebola outbreak in Africa, but now we have a new Ebola vaccine that's being fast-tracked to get out onto the market as soon as possible. A fascinating study analyzed the ways in which DMT alters your brain activity and your brain waves, finding that DMT puts you into a kind of waking dream state. And another study examined the ways in which 5-methoxy-DMT inhaled from the dried venom of a Sonoran desert toad could actually improve your mental health. There was an experimental study that identified an enzyme from a microbe found in the human gut that can actually modify type A blood into universal donor blood, and this has huge medical value. We also learned that human fetuses developed temporary muscles in the hands, which are an atavistic throwback to the anatomy and development of our evolutionary ancestors. There was some research that discovered how malaria was transmitted from gorillas to humans. Another study found that the tuberculosis vaccine appears to reduce the lifetime risk of lung cancer, and a woman in Japan was the world's first recipient of a corneal transplant made from stem cells. We also got to meet a curious Scottish woman who has some kind of strange condition where she can't feel pain, where she heals quickly from her wounds, and where she can't feel fear. That's pretty crazy. It's kind of like a superhero origin story. But then we also got to meet a young girl with an antibiotic-resistant infection whose life was saved with the antibiotic alternative known as phage therapy. Specifically, a new kind of phage therapy with phages genetically modified to be more effective. On a somewhat darker note, the FBI raided the Biologic Resource Center in Arizona, and they found a grisly chop shop of human remains, with freezers full of sloppily stored, unlabeled human remains. There's a strain of malaria sweeping through Southeast Asia, and it's resistant to virtually all of the drugs we've used to try and treat it. And I also covered a number of horror stories about individual patients. All of these patients suffered injuries or infections that were bizarre and disgusting, which are the foundational qualities of any good hospital story. These included the guy whose scrotum swelled up to the size of a pumpkin because of a possible parasitic infection, a guy who had blackouts and seizures because of a big tapeworm living in his brain for over a decade. There was a couple of unfortunate women who were the first humans in the world to have documented cases of cattle eyeball worm parasitizing their own human eyeballs, and a patient who suffered a motorcycle accident and then got their wounds infected by 2 species of bacteria that actually interacted with each other in the body to devastating effect. And at the very end of the year, the CDC released a list of antibiotic-resistant pathogens, including those bacterial and fungal pathogens that were of some concern, all the way up to those that the CDC said required urgent attention. There was also a bit of biology in the political sphere. Public policy is often the victim of scientific ignorance, and even in 2019, we still have to deal with misinformed religious ideologues in every government office, from local school board to the White House. We saw this firsthand when the Trump administration solidified the regulatory capture of the EPA, making them enforce policies that recklessly endangered human health and the environment. There was also the government shutdown, which led to tragic destruction of protected Joshua trees in Joshua Tree National Park. We also had state legislators and school board members from Utah pitch a fit over having to teach evolution in their biology classes. And in a very similar circumstance, there was a school chairman in Florida who wanted to censor evolution from his school curriculum. But on the other hand, there was some good news involving biology and politics, like in Nepal, where conservation efforts managed to double their wild tiger population over the last decade, and in Africa, where the largest wildlife preserve on the continent announced that they had gone a full year without any elephant poaching, and that's always awesome to hear. Also in Africa, the northern white rhino species is nearing its end, but eggs were taken from the last 2 females to be used in vitro in southern white rhino surrogates. Less happy news comes from Malaysia, where, despite conservation efforts, the last Sumatran rhino died near the end of this year. There was some news about new genetic modification that came out this year, including an article about latent genes in tomatoes that could be turned on to make the tomatoes produce capsaicin, so that they would be spicy like peppers. There were experimental brain organoids, or mini brain organs, grown in petri dishes that were then implanted into the spinal cords of mice just to see what would happen. Something similar was also happening in Japan, where researchers were creating so-called human-animal hybrids by creating human organoids and implanting them into mice. Scientists also worked on an E. coli strain and modified its genome so that it would produce pure psilocybin, which could be a revolutionary new way to manufacture the drug that's creating a revolution in psychotherapy and mental health medicine. With respect to the larger world of living things, all kinds of stuff was discovered or achieved in 2019, including the full mapping of the incredibly complex axolotl genome, the full mapping of the great white shark genome, a genetic analysis of jellyfish that discovered a whole bunch of new fluorescent proteins, and a genetic analysis of bedbugs that discovered that they once parasitized dinosaurs. We found a huge treasure trove of Cambrian-era fossils in China, and we found a huge treasure trove of crustacean fossils, including all kinds of weird species, like one crab with weird, super large eyeballs. And perhaps most exciting, we found a massive trove of really well-preserved fossils that depict the evolution of plants and animals for the first million years after the asteroid impact that killed the dinosaurs. This study was super cool, so I think you should definitely check it out. We found a new species of millipede that had been encased in amber for 99 million years. We found a microfossil that's over 1 billion years old that might be the oldest terrestrial fungus ever discovered. And we found a 2 billion year old fossil which turned out to be the oldest fossil depicting movement at the multicellular scale. There was a study that showed how Pleistocene Eurasian humans happened to live at the same time as 12-foot tall birds, which they probably hunted for food, or which probably hunted humans for food. There was a study that analyzed the fossils of giant penguins and giant parrots that lived in the forests and grasslands of New Zealand, and another study documenting New Zealand's avian biodiversity calculated that it would take millions of years for that biodiversity to recover from human impact. Some researchers from Japan and Thailand discovered the fossils of dinosaurs with shark-like teeth. There was a study on dinosaurs that examined their vasculature to see how they got rid of excess heat to avoid dying of heat stroke, and another study examined the fossils of a strange bird that sat at a fascinating evolutionary crossroads between dinosaur and modern bird. Another study looked at the fossils of an amphibious whale ancestor, which gives us insight into the story of whale evolution. We also learned that hermit crabs evolved large penises to fend off attackers, that coral reef ecologies are sustained by the enormous but humble, quiet contribution of cryptobenthic fish. We learned that there's a species of sea snake that evolved a strange kind of gills through convergent evolution. We learned that there's a species of giant virus that has a strange kind of CRISPR-like immune system, and that there's some kind of soil bacteria that produces a chemical that can be used to safely ward off mosquitoes. There was also a report published by the California Academy of Sciences that proudly described the 71 new species of plant and animal that their scientists discovered this year. We learned that fly larvae parasitically damage finch beaks, which can have lifelong consequences for the bird. There was a study that documented the spread of a fungal disease that's killing frogs and other amphibians all over the world. There was a study that explored the ways in which dogs mirror human emotions, like stress and anxiety, and there was a really cool study that examined photosensitive cells in sea snake skin, which allowed them to more effectively hide in the shadows near a coral reef. There was a study that looked at an odd little tree stump that was somehow still alive and made eye-opening discoveries about forest ecology. There was a study about a weird group of wood ants who formed a creepy little death colony inside of a Cold War-era weapons bunker. There was a study about Saharan silver ants that examined the selective pressures that gave them such remarkable running speed, and there was a multi-continental study that explored the divergence and radiation of the evolutionarily marvelous stick bugs and leaf bugs. One particularly cool piece of science news was that in the South Pacific, there is a newly emerged island, a new volcanic island that's being colonized by plants and insects. In Siberia, there was an incredibly well-preserved foal that lived sometime 42,000 years ago, and after it was discovered, preserved in the permafrost, the scientists were able to extract some of its blood for analysis. There was also the terrifying and harrowing story of an older Russian man who was attacked by a bear and dragged back into its den where it stored him as food. Climate change and human impact are ever-present problems that are here with us for the long haul, and in 2019, these impacts were seen all over the world, like in South Africa, with the premature death of the iconic baobab trees. In Namibia, we saw lions that were pushed out of their habitat adapting to hunt coastal life forms, like seals and seabirds. In Australia, we saw insane heat waves that cooked animals alive and boiled away the rivers. Even worse, later in the year, this heat and the dryness would lead to widespread forest fires. In the South Pacific, there was an oil tanker that crashed onto a reef and spilled oil onto an extremely valuable World Heritage Reef ecosystem. There was also a study exploring how mosquito-carried diseases will spread to higher latitudes as the climate warms up, how cockroaches are becoming increasingly resistant to insecticides, and how zooplankton communities, which are integral to the marine and terrestrial food webs, are being disrupted by warming water temperature and increasing ocean acidification. Perhaps most ominous was a study about thawing permafrost and the ancient diseases that are reawakening in the freshly warmed soil. There was also some good news, like when the Chinese government announced a project to plant forests the size of Ireland in an attempt to sequester CO2 and slow down climate change. A study from North America identified a microbe in New Jersey wetlands that can break down PFAS contaminants. And on this note, we also discovered a bacterial species in a lake in Mexico that is somehow able to preferentially ingest and sequester not just one, but two different radioactive isotopes, which are both products of human pollution. And even better, there was a really cool study that demonstrated that mealworms can fully digest polystyrene, even when it's laced with a fire-retardant chemical. There were also fascinating discoveries made in space, with implications for alien life. A frozen exoplanet that might be able to host life was found in orbit around the nearby Barnard star. There was two potentially habitable exoplanets that were found in orbit around the old, stable Teegarden star. A rather discouraging paper came out that suggested that life was not likely, or even possible, on a frozen ocean moon, like Enceladus or Europa. But later in the year, there was a more encouraging paper that calculated that the UV radiation from red dwarf stars was, surprisingly, unlikely to be a serious obstacle to life emerging and evolving on any nearby planets orbiting that red dwarf star. There was yet another study that estimated that our galaxy contains several billion Earth-like planets, which really goes to show you how likely it is that there's life elsewhere in the cosmos. And there was even a study that identified a type of exoplanet that could be even more conducive to life and even more biodiverse than the Earth itself. A study looking at meteorite samples was able to identify the biologically important cyanide molecule, and another study also looking at meteorite samples was able to identify ribose sugar. The Cassini mission identified the building blocks of amino acids in the ice residues blasting out of the cracks at the southern pole of Enceladus, which would suggest a biochemically fertile subcrust environment. I love every study that hints at the possibility that there is life underneath the icy crust of Enceladus, or Europa, or Titan, or any of those other Jovian or Saturnian moons. Also, there's a Japanese company called Space Food X, which launched an initiative to develop technology to grow food in microgravity for space colonization. Now that's super cool, and I really hope that project is coming along nicely. Also, there was some research into human reproduction in space, which is also some super cool science that we legitimately have to understand before we'll ever be able to colonize space and other moons and planets. On Mars, we discovered that the polar ice sheets are much more extensive than we once thought, and that's really exciting because it means that there's a source of water in situ for any potential human colonists. Even more exciting, the Curiosity rover started to find weird plumes of methane coming out of Mars's crust, suggesting some kind of soil-based process that's generating this methane and releasing it in plumes from vents or cracks in the surface. Could this methanogenic process be organic? Is this evidence of life? We might even find out for sure, with more research coming in the next year, like the NASA Mars 2020 mission, which will look for microscopic fossils in the Jezero crater, an area that shows lots of ancient evidence of flowing water. As if the methane mystery wasn't cool enough, we also discovered that Mars has weird oxygen fluctuations, but we have no idea how or why. NASA also announced a billion-dollar mission to Saturn's moon Titan, where they plan to use a drone to fly or jump from site to site, which will allow the drone to explore and image a huge area, relative to the slow and limited exploration of the robotic landers on Mars. The SETI organization announced that they would use a submersible probe to study deep-sea hydrothermal vents in an attempt to learn more about the biochemistry of biogenesis and how this might apply to deep-sea vents on exoplanets and exomoons. Now, a little closer to home, regarding our own moon, there was some ill-fated action on Luna this year. China tried to place a lander on the far side of the moon, which included a biohabitat module that would grow silkworms and some plants, like potatoes. But the experiment failed, and everything on board died. Another mission to the moon, this time a fully privately funded mission from Israel, crashed on the moon and possibly contaminated it with tardigrades. Now this was a stupid mistake, and I think it's a damning comment on the quality and the ethics of the private space industry with respect to biocontamination and maintaining research purity. If you want to hear me talk about this particular issue in more detail, then go check out this particular Science News episode. Alright, so there's your quick rundown of the biology science news in 2019. To keep up with this tradition, I'll end this video by listing what I think were the 3 biggest science news stories of the year. The honorable mention this year is a callback to the biggest science news story of 2018. Last year, the story that I chose to be the most important science news of 2018 was when Chinese geneticist Dr. Jin Kui genetically modified some human embryos and then brought them to term. 2 twin girls were born in 2018, and that created a ton of really wild headlines and a lot of controversy. After the news broke, Dr. Jin Kui disappeared. He went into Chinese government custody, and it was revealed very late in the year that he was sentenced to 3 years in prison for his fraudulent activities and his unethical research approach. An easily overlooked detail in some of those articles is that there was a 3rd genetically modified embryo. This was mentioned almost in passing, and earlier in 2019, that 3rd genetically modified baby was born somewhere in China. We don't know its name, we don't know its parents, we don't know where the baby lives, and we don't know if it was even born at all, as the Chinese government shut all of this stuff down pretty quickly, and very probably forced the parents to abort this genetically modified fetus. So the probable birth of that third modified baby takes the honorable mention, because this issue is just so significant, and it will only become more relevant as humanity progresses and alters more of its germline. Alright, now the number 3 biggest science news story of the year is all of the stuff that's been happening with the EPA under the Trump administration. Now, I only had one science news episode about this the whole year, and it was near the beginning of the year. But throughout all of 2019, the Trump administration has repealed countless environmental protections, from standards for air and water quality to standards for waste emissions and energy efficiency. Decades of legal work protecting people and the environment from big industry are being dismantled in a matter of weeks. The EPA has been completely corrupted, and now it advocates for policies that don't protect the environment, but in fact, they advocate for policies that protect big industry at the expense of the environment and innocent people. At a time when environmentally friendly policies are more critical than ever, this level of corruption and the direction that it's taking us with respect to environmental policy is nothing less than an unmitigated disaster. Trump's handling of the EPA should be criminal, because thousands of people are going to die because of these policy changes. Trump will have the blood of thousands of Americans on his hands, because these people were injured or killed prematurely by air or water pollution. Alright, the number 2 biggest science news story of the year goes to the expanded Medicaid program in Michigan. Now, the results of this study aren't exactly super surprising. I mean, there's been a lot of research before into the effectiveness of Medicare and Medicaid and other kinds of public health systems. The reason why I think this is so important this year is because in American politics, healthcare has truly become a critical issue. It's no secret that the American healthcare system is abysmal. It's prohibitively expensive, bankrupting families left and right, and the debt is driving people to suicide, if they aren't killed outright by their untreated illness or injury first. The presidential candidate, Bernie Sanders, has a heart-rending story of a military vet who said that he couldn't afford healthcare, and his only option at this point was suicide. Bernie talked the man down and worked with him to pay off his medical debt, and now the guy says that he has a reason to live again. Bernie Sanders is proposing to reform the American healthcare system to be like other modern countries, and his plan is Medicare for all. This study hits the number 2 spot because it's a perfect piece of evidence supporting Bernie's policy, and I think it'll go a long way towards convincing my fellow Americans that this really is the right way to go. And finally, we come to the number 1 science news story of 2019. Now, I had a really hard time choosing what this number 1 issue was going to be. On one hand, I was thinking that it could be the story about the baobabs, as this is quite likely a deathly harbinger of climate change. But on the other hand, I was thinking about the Mars 2020 rover, and how it seems like we're right on the edge of discovering alien life. But ultimately, I decided to go with a story that came out later in the year, about blood clots in astronauts. The reason that I went with this news story is because it has huge consequences for the future of the human species. If we are ever going to colonize space, or another planet or moon, we will need to learn how the human body reacts to these new exotic environments. This study examined blood flow in microgravity, and found some troubling but critically important information about how blood clots in space. To me, this study seemed to hold more significance than it first appears. This is more than just a study on human blood flow on Earth and in microgravity. This is a fantastic example of the research that's being done to make sure that humans can live and work in outer space. It's a fantastic example of the collective research being done to propel humanity into the cosmos, to turn us into an interplanetary civilization, and to secure for our entire species a perpetual existence in the depths of space. Alright, so there you have it. that's my recap of the news from the year 2019. That was a lot of stuff. Some of it was really exciting. Some of it was really depressing. Some of it was really disgusting. But all of it was super awesome and really interesting. I'm really looking forward to all of the cool stuff that we're going to learn about in the year 2020. And I'm excited to make science news segments discussing as much of it as I possibly can.